Hi everyone! Thanks for tuning into our podcast, Midnight Duo. My name is Cindy, and my charming co-host is my supportive fiance, Keonhee.
Hey, Keonhee here. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Excited to be here.
So I've been a long-time listener of true crime, starting with My Favorite Murder in 2018, and then have basically followed along all of my favorite shows throughout the year, like Morbid, Rotten Mango, Crime Junkie, if I was going to name a few. I've always wanted to start my own podcast, so this is kind of a little pet project of mine that hopefully is going to bloom into something more. But you can expect me to be doing my own research, diving down internet rabbit holes, and then ultimately putting on my detective hat while I tell Connie about all the stories that I found to see if we can wrap our heads around all the wild things that happen in life, some of which we still don't have answers for. Midnight Duo is all about true crime, mysteries, disappearances, and the unexplained. I've heard in the past that enjoying true crime content can be a little bit of a red flag for some people, but there are definitely stories that I've heard over the years that have really stuck with me. One being Amy Lee Bradley, the disappearance of Maura Murray, the Somerton Man, which has in recent years been solved. It reminds me that one, as a woman, you should always be vigilant. Two, that there are some really sick people out there in the world and it's better to be safe than sorry. And then three, that a lot of these stories are still important and they should be shared. In regards to the paranormal stuff, my family growing up was deeply, deeply superstitious and we believed in ghosts, all that stuff. My mom grew up in a community that was rife with mysticism and shamans. So in all, I just kind of like a good scare every now and then. I love spooky topics, I always have. Whether it's the paranormal or the human psyche, it's all really fascinating to me. I do have a list of topics that I want to talk about eventually, and to give you guys a sneak peek into the list, there are a few. Father Antoine Gellis, this is the guy who inspired the Da Vinci Code. The unsolved Austin yogurt shop murders, because Connie and I live in Austin, so I thought that'd be interesting to do a local one. The origin of Amber Alerts, and then the visions of Joan d'Arc, and so much more. So, without further ado, let's get into the episode. What I'm going to be discussing today, it has been a long time coming. Connie and I have been trying to record this episode for the past 3 days. I've had the script written out for a month. And we just haven't had time to do it. So I'm so excited to be finally talking about the disappearance of the Frog Boys in Korea.
Frog Boys?
Yeah, I picked this topic first and foremost because, like I told you, I have a list of 25 topics so far. Basically, you're South Korean. I thought it would be pretty simple to narrow down the list because I had so many to choose from and I didn't know how to start. Have you ever heard about the missing Frog Boys of South Korea?
This is the first.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So, the Frog Boys, or Gaeguri Sonyeon.
Gaeguri Sonyeon.
Gaeguri Sonyeon.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. This is a case about 5 schoolboys that went missing in South Korea in 1991. They went missing while allegedly out searching for salamander eggs, but we'll find out a little later as to why it's Gaeguri Sonyeon, or the Frog Boys. They went missing in the southeastern city of Daegu. Am I saying that right?
Daegu.
From what I understand, Daegu is a pretty big city population-wise. It's third after Seoul and Busan. It's largely surrounded by mountains in the east and the west, many of which are extensively covered by trees. South Korea at this time was experiencing a lot of changes. They were transitioning from an authoritarian to a democratic regime beginning in the late 1980s. People were moving from rural to urban areas, more women were entering the workforce or getting a higher education, and the early 1990s was birthing the rise of K-pop as we know it today. In Korean, it's family name first, and then first name. So you'll hear me referring to the boys that went missing as their family name, and then their parents as family name as well. So the 5 boys that went missing are Woo Chol-won, Jo Ho-yeon, Kim Yong-gyu, Park Chan-in, and Kim Jon-sik. The 5 boys were between the ages of 9 and 13. They all attended the same elementary school, Songso. These kids basically reminded me of like my childhood friends. Their families lived really close together in the village outside of Daegu city, and their houses formed kind of a circle, kind of like the end of a cul-de-sac. And then all of the boys hung out together near a paddy field that was right in front of their homes. So these boys were very, very loved. I found a few quotes online just about what their parents had to say about them. They were said to be, quote, closer than brothers. They were like the 5 musketeers. Cholwan's father said. Young-gyu was his parents' only son. His father said that he was very close to him and, quote, we tried to give him all of the love that he deserved, and he loved us back. He was very bright, cheerful, he had a great personality. And Chanin's father said that he never gave his family trouble and was almost too sincere. On March 26, 1991, although the boys attended the same school, Korea was holding elections at that time, which made it a public holiday. Around 9 a.m., Woo's father remembers that his son came back to get a thicker jacket, and he asked him where he was going, but he didn't really give him a clear answer, and he just said, oh, I'll be playing outside. A little past 1 p.m., he gets a call from his son's Taekwondo academy because the boy hadn't shown up for his lesson. And it was soon after that he realized it wasn't only his son that had gone missing. Woo's father says, quote, a friend told us that they had seen the 5 boys. He asked them where they were going, and the boys replied, oh, we're going to find salamander eggs. That's why we thought the boys had gone up the mountain. Now, there is a mountain near their home called Mount Waryong. It has an army base to the left, a pond on the right, and then a shooting range just above the pond. With this information, the parents started searching the mountain, hoping that they're going to find the boys, but there was no sign of them. By late afternoon, it's reported to the local police that the boys are missing, and a local journalist at the time recalls that initially, their disappearance wasn't very big news. Like I mentioned, the pro-democracy movement in Korea was growing. The journalist said that everyone's attention was basically focused on just who was going to be elected. The police just thought, the boys are being boys, they're out playing, but that they'd make their way home. The police told the parents to be patient and just wait. Obviously, these parents are frustrated. Time goes on, it's becoming clear that the boys are not coming home on their own, and they blamed local police on their lack of initiative to find the boys. That night, the night that the kids had gone missing, Mr. Kim has a dream. He says, quote, it was pouring. My son was right outside the door. He peeked inside, but without a word, he was gone. I ran after him, calling his name, but he wouldn't even turn back to look back, end quote. So I read this, and I literally had chills.
I have chills right now.
Because I just can't imagine, like, being a parent, and then first you go to the police and you say, my son's missing, and they say, haha, no, like, they're just being boys, they'll come back home. And then they don't come back home hours later. And then you have to go to bed. They're not home. You have to go to bed, and you're just, like, all this paranoia and angst and anxiety is just, like, eating up at you while you try to, like...
And you have that type of dream.
I know, yeah. Anyways, moving on. 5 or 6 days after their disappearance, word eventually spreads, or I guess in this case is misspread. There's a local news broadcast about the 5 boys, but it says they're still missing after trying to catch frogs. And that is how they got the moniker of the Frog Boys. The reporter recalls that, quote, 2 days after the broadcast, it becomes citywide news. Then a week after, everyone was talking about whether or not the kids were alive. Then the story blows up and it becomes nationwide news. 9 days after the kids go missing, on May 4th, the parents attended a news program called The Square of Public Opinions. Basically, they are using this platform to call out the police and expressing their dissatisfaction with the investigation. They criticized, for example, police creating pamphlets that called the children runaways. One of the parents says, quote, this indicates that the police are trying to wrap up this case quickly. We want them to change this, end quote. This broadcast happened from the boys' elementary school and was quoted as a very rare event. Though I'm not sure if they're referring to it being a nationwide broadcast or the boys' disappearance being rare. But the broadcast itself is a big opportunity to get more coverage and make the case known. The broadcast is happening, and they get this phone call that seems like it's one of the boys. It's cut off, and the telephone operator says, oh my gosh, it's one of the boys, it's John sick, he's sobbing, he's asking for his mom. The audience starts freaking out. They start cheering. They're like, yes, the boys are alive. We need to go look for them. Where are they? But this call just gives everyone false hope because it ended up being a prank. which is sickening in itself because why would you just pile on and torture these parents like that?
Yeah, that's messed up.
Yeah, I did some research just seeing what the law was. Like, can you make prank calls like that? And, like, would you get punished for it? And it's pretty country to country, state to state on if it's a fine, if it's a misdemeanor, if it's a felony. But it's just a little disheartening.
Yeah, and how do you enforce that type of rule? How do you stop someone? And it's in the 1980s, so that means that they were probably using telephone poles.
1990s.
1990s, even then.
But
they didn't have cell phones yet.
Yeah. So, on the upside, after this broadcast, the boys' disappearance caught the president at the time's attention. The president was Roh Tae-woo. He makes a statement and orders a further investigation. All in all, he orders over 300,000 police officers and military members to the search. Thousands upon thousands of people mobilized to find these boys. For 1 year, volunteers formed lines and searched the mountain where the boys were thought to have gone missing. Park recalls, quote, "The police looked for any evidence they could find, but by then there was no point in searching because there were no traces left. The police were just following orders, so they pretended to do something. We, as the parents, meant nothing to them," end quote. And I told you how these boys were genuinely loved before. The 5 fathers ended up taking matters into their own hands. They quit their jobs, they rented a small lorry, which is similar to a small truck, and they searched the entire country, rain or shine. In addition to milk cartons, billboards, newspapers, and more, the fathers handed out pamphlets in public spaces and eventually met a man by the name of Na Jubong. Na is the chairman of the National Organization of Finding Missing Children and Family. Na recalls, quote, "One day, we noticed that Yonggyu's father looked pale, and his face was turning blue. He was addicted to sleeping pills. We realized that even a strong man was losing his health after a while. Seeing the fathers become weaker like that, I couldn't turn my back on them," end quote.
That's heartbreaking.
I know. Many of the parents were rightfully angry. They're in this limbo state of being unable to grieve because they didn't know what happened to their sons, and either turn to alcohol or pills to manage their anger. And this obviously is all happening behind closed doors. In public, they presented a very united front and continued to meet with journalists and reporters throughout the country to get more coverage on their missing boys. After a year of searching, however, it becomes apparent that it wasn't just the press that was interested in the story. Na recalls at one of the press conferences, a man had given him his business card, which only had his name and number, but no organization on it. He later sees this man at another media event and finds out that this man is working for an intelligence agency. The fathers were being followed and their movements were being recorded. Park says, quote, "Instead of suspecting us, they should have been searching for the kids," end quote. The men for the intelligence agency, however, said that they were just trying to protect the parents, which Na and the parents strongly doubted.
Yeah, that seems super suspicious.
Yeah.
Why did they have people following them? It just seems like a waste of resources. They're kind of right. They should have just been looking for the kids.
I feel like this next part will kind of answer that question. It's like, I don't want to spoil it, but so remember on this mountain, I told you there's a military base, there's a pond, and there's a shooting range. By now, the public is starting to point their fingers at the military, and they're wondering why no one's questioning them. Apparently, on the day that the children went missing, a family friend, who at this point was just a boy, he had heard gunshots, screams, then silence. He was later asked about it again, and he confirmed that's what he heard. Gunshots, screams, then silence. But the police just took this as a rumor, not as serious evidence, so they never really investigated this angle. Fortunately, after a few years, the trail goes cold, the public's interest in the case starts to fade. The fathers continued to be the driving force behind looking for the missing boys. Kim recalls the parents going into news stations and literally being kicked out due to their demands, and on top of these heartbreaking circumstances, after 3 years of searching, the families are starting to go into debt. And they have other family members to take care of. So after 3 years of searching, they announced that they would return to the workforce. 2 years after that, there is an allegation made against one of the fathers that the police end up investigating. A criminal psychologist, his name is Kim Ga-won, alleged that the children were buried at John Sik's home because on the day that they disappeared, for 3 of the first few hours that the kids disappeared, they didn't know where John Sik's dad was. His whereabouts couldn't be accounted for.
Oh, very curious.
So during this period, there weren't a lot of criminal psychologists in South Korea, let alone criminal psychologists that had studied in America. So this guy, Kim Ga-won, his words had a lot of pull. He claims that he analyzed all the evidence and the footage and came to this conclusion. The other parents kept telling him he's wrong, that the criminal psychologist is wrong. Basically, what type of guy, what type of man would A, murder his child, his friend's children, and then bury them under his home? The police end up searching John-sik's home and found children's shoes in a toilet.
Oh, 3 years later?
Yeah.
In the toilet?
Yeah. So they bring in an excavator. They essentially ruin the home, excavating, and they find nothing.
Why were shoes in the toilet?
I have no idea. I feel like, I don't know. As a kid, like, I threw random stuff into the toilet. So I feel like that's just like,
yeah, okay.
you know, like,
Sure.
it's not saying like, oh, these are the shoes that the kids went missing in, like, these are their school shoes. It's just saying, like, they found shoes in the toilet. And I feel like, as a kid, I don't know, people out there who are parents know, like, your kids just be doing weird things.
That's fair.
Yeah.
But I just don't remember. I don't think I ever threw shoes in the toilet as a kid.
I don't think I threw shoes into the toilet either, but I'm really trying to give this dude the benefit of the doubt.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's not get stuck on this one. But
Okay.
It's still weird.
Yeah, so they bring in an excavator, ruin his home, they don't find anything. Nothing. So, at this time, a lot of people and media outlets are gathering to watch the excavation, and for some reason, John-sik just starts running. And people are like screaming, catch him! And then he's taken to a police station for his safety. He dies 5 years later from liver cancer, while he's only in his 40s. Woo, one of the other fathers, believes that John-sik becomes sick from exhaustion for looking for his missing son after all these years. So, a year after John-sik passes away, 11 years after the boys first went missing, their remains were found on September 26, 2002.
11 years later?
Yeah.
Wow.
2 local men who were hiking and collecting acorns had stumbled upon the bones a couple of kilometers away from the village. The police called in a forensic scientist, his name is Chae Jong-min, who arrives at the scene. He says what he walks into is absurd. When the parents arrived, there was already a crowd of onlookers looking at the clothes and the bones that were found, and the local police just weren't experts in this type of stuff. Like, they weren't detectives, they're just, blue-collar local police. They were kind of just digging stuff up. A coroner or someone who is specialized in this kind of work, you would organize the bones to form a complete body. But the local police were kind of just putting long bones over here and skulls over there, and it was just absurd. It was a mess. Everything was riddled with mistakes. And the parents are here. Like, the parents are watching them do all of this. They're crying, they're grieving, they're finally getting a sense that this relationship that they had with their sons has ended 11 years later. This is the end of the line. They've found the boys. And even though they found them, they just feel absolutely worthless and equally as outraged. The police called them to, quote, identify the remains, but then essentially goofed up the process. They were pissed because, they're just dumping similar looking bones amongst one another. They're pissed because they feel powerless when it comes to the police, because the police have all of the law on their side. At the time, there wasn't a protocol yet for specialists and not local police to excavate evidence. Among the remains, one of the boys' shirts was tied into a knot, and when untied, empty cartridges and unused bullets fell out, and the bullets were between 1 to 5 centimeters long. This led the fathers to think that the boys were shot.
That's very interesting, because in Korea, the only people that have guns are the military and the police. And that boy earlier had said he had heard gunshots. And it was by a military base. Continue on.
So, I love how, layman's persons like you and me, like, that's what we think of, right? But no. The chief of police, however, says, since the bones were huddled together, he believes they most likely died due to natural causes, specifically hypothermia. Because at the time, the local temperature recorded was 3 degrees Celsius, which is around 37 degrees Fahrenheit.
But that boy came home for a thicker jacket. Remember that? You told me that. Yeah, no, this seems like cap. All of this is a little suspicious.
I think a lot of people thought that too. So in this instance, that prompted help from the Korean Alpine Federation. This organization is often called in for emergencies because of their experience in mountainous areas. So they come in and they check the site where the boys are found at. And what do you know? They determined that no, hypothermia couldn't have been the cause. One of the rescuers says, quote, "Just use common sense. This site isn't even 100 meters from the streets. If it was cold and raining, it would have taken them 5 minutes to run home."
Yeah, I mean, he's not wrong.
The strongest evidence of foul play, according to Che, the forensic scientist, was that, quote, "If a child died naturally, the bones would have been found on top of the dirt. Because when a corpse is on top of the dirt, it rots, animals come, rip up the body, which means that the bones would have been separated. However, the bones were all buried, which means that someone killed them and meticulously hid them there. So we needed to figure out why, and we couldn't," end quote. What was confirmed by the 50th Infantry Division was that the bullets found with the body were from its shooting range. Strangely, though, the military spoke up and insisted that since it was a public holiday that day, there were no shooting drills. Basically, they're trying to say, there's no way stray bullets from the drills would have hit the kids.
It was 11 years ago, and conveniently enough, they're saying this now.
Yeah, so there's a caveat to that. That even though there wasn't a drill scheduled, a commissioned officer can come and practice anytime they want.
Oh, okay, come on.
I know! In 1994, the shooting range, the boys went missing in 91. In 94, the shooting range was relocated to a nearby town. But when they looked at old maps, the area that the boys were found in was only 300 meters away. And at minimum, 100 meters away from where the old range used to be. If you were curious, that's about the range of an M16. It's reported that there was an officer firing off shots that day to use leftover bullets, though his identity has never been confirmed. Later on, Che's team studied the bones and found marks that looked like sharp cuts on 3 of the 5 boys' skulls, possibly made by a metal farming tool. One of the boys had his clothes inside out, to which Che believes his eyes were covered by the culprit before he was beaten on their heads and murdered. The public believes that this was the work of a psychopath, but Che surmises that if that were true, there would be other similar cases, but there are none before or after the boys' disappearance. With little progress on the investigation, 2 years after the boys' remains were found and stored in a university morgue for the time being, they were finally given a proper burial. Somebody donated chrysanthemums, and the hearse was absolutely covered in them. The parents were grateful that they could at least send the boys off properly. Park says, quote, "They died together, so we wanted them to play together in the afterlife."
My heart.
I know, I'm literally tearing up. So, the parents' lawyer, Kang Ji-won, filed a lawsuit against the police for, quote, not having done their jobs properly. For example, they botched the evidence at the crime scene. They called the children runaways. They didn't take them seriously as missing children from the beginning, just to name a few things. But despite 3 trials, the police were never held accountable in any regard. At the time of the disappearance, President Roh's power was military-backed. So there's a theory that one of the boys were killed accidentally, the rest were killed to cover up the accident.
Mm-hmm. That's my leading theory.
In present day, no one has ever been arrested in connection to this case. Korea originally had a statute of limitations that was capped at 15 years. Then it was extended to 25 years, and then it was abolished in 2007. So with the advances in the legal system, police sympathies, forensic methods, the parents still have hope that one day the criminal or criminals will be found and brought to justice. In 2021, on the 30th anniversary of the boys' disappearance, the city of Daegu installed a monument to honor the boys near the location that they were found, called the Frog Boy Memorial and Children's Safety Prayer Monument. In the same year, the police renewed their interest in the case, announcing a new task force dedicated to the investigation. Apparently, they already received a tip that they reviewed in several ways, even sending it to Korea's National Forensic Service, but decided that it lacked credibility. The police agency chief, Kim Jin-pyo, says, quote, "If additional reports come in, we will conduct extensive investigations and deploy new investigative techniques," end quote. The bereaved family has urged officials to create a National Assembly-level fact-finding committee to uncover the truth surrounding the original investigation and what really happened to their boys. I didn't mention this before because I couldn't find more information on it. But police say that on September 25th, a day before the boys were found, somebody called anonymously and said, "If you want to find the boys, this is where they'll be," and gave the location of Mount Moryong. And so they traced the caller ID, but I'm not sure if it ever went anywhere. I just think it's really bizarre that someone made this call, and then the next day, 2 hikers found the bodies.
Wait, so they called the day before they found the bodies? Years later?
Yeah. So the boys were found on the 26th, and on the 25th, just the day before, someone called and said, "If you want to find the boys, they're on Mount Moryong."
That's suspicious.
It is suspicious, but at the same time, I feel like it could just be a coincidence.
Guilty conscience.
Because, the article didn't specify if the person said exactly where on the mountain. I think if public opinion were already suspecting the military, then someone could have just connected that and said, yeah, if the military shot the boys and they're on the mountain somewhere, look harder on the mountain. Yeah, I just wish there was a little more info on that, but a lot of the research that I was doing was in Korean, so I had to translate and kind of just double check other articles, but it was only mentioned in one article.
Interesting.
Yeah. That is the case of the Frog Boys of South Korea. I've read about this case even before doing this podcast, and it's definitely one of those ones that stick with you. One, that the dads all quit their jobs.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. And then eventually one of the dads kind of just lost his mind, it seems like, and then he gets victimized.
Yeah.
And he died from liver cancer, which probably came from him drinking too much.
Yeah.
From being stressed.
It's also, I don't think of Korea as a very violent place. As compared to, people get murdered and there's disappearances in America and I'm sure other parts of the country, but Korea just doesn't come up as one of those more dangerous places for me, and I think this is why the Frog Boys is, I don't want to say a popular case, but it's just so mind-boggling that these kids went missing, and it's been 30 years and people still have no idea what happened.
Yeah.
So something else to break your heart. At the funeral, Wu read to the boys, quote, "It's said that when your parents die, you bury them in the ground, but when your children die, you bury them in your heart."
Oh, I just got chills.
So sad. I mean, yeah, again, I just feel like the dads did so much, and they had, all the odds were stacked against them. The police didn't believe them, dads quit their jobs for 3 years, and were just just doing everything they can to figure out what happened to my kids.
Mm-hmm. Like any good dad would.
Yeah. Again, I feel like the more that I talk about this case, I just start to get really emotional.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe because they're kids, and maybe because the kids were loved so much by their parents. But they're, like, even with their funeral, some anonymous person donated hundreds of chrysanthemum flowers for the hearse. There are a couple of documentaries out there on Apple TV. Loads of other podcasters, I feel like, have done this case. So if you guys are interested, you could definitely check those out. There's also interviews that the parents give that are online that you could watch. So after hearing all of this, what do you think happened?
Well, here are a couple of my thoughts. I think it's a tragedy that the police acted in such a slow manner, that they responded so later, and that even after the parents in the neighborhood or all the people from that neighborhood responded and told them to kind of look at this this matter more urgently, it took them, you said earlier, about 9 days later for it to become an issue. And then at that point, even when the president said something and mobilized it, I don't know if his intentions were pure, because it was too little too late at that point. Even though you mobilized 300,000 people, it's way too late. Because I think here in Texas, I think the stat is if you don't find the kid within a certain amount of days, the odds that you find them decrease by however so much.
Yeah, they say the first 48 hours are the most crucial.
Exactly, and they did it weeks later, or even months later, where they were like, "Oh, let's finally find these kids." How do you expect to find 5 kids months later? So my leading theory, I think, from what I heard, is if there were bullets buried next to the body, more likely than anything, the only way those bullets came from anywhere, because in Korea the only way to get bullets is either if you're a cop or on the black market or in the military. The black market doesn't seem as likely. It had to have come from either a police officer or a military member. And the fact that the shooting range is only 100 meters away, which we know is not it's the size of a football field, or a little less, a little more. It had to have been some sort of freak accident, and like you said, it might have been to cover. Maybe one kid got shot, and the rest of the kids got executed as a cover-up, which is even more tragic. Yeah. And like you said, there was a kid that said he had heard gunshots and screams. You don't just hear gunshots and screams in the middle of Daegu. Which is probably a rural area. So that's my theory.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's people out there that know what happened.
For sure.
And they either haven't, they're high up there to where they can't be touched. They've moved away, finished service and moved away and never have to think about this again. I don't think it was a psychopath that the kids just happened to run across. I think it was a freak accident. Yeah, I think it was a freak accident. I think it was something really tragic that happened where the military were involved. Just the way that their clothes were tied up, again, they were buried. Animals didn't scatter their bodies or anything. I definitely think someone out there knows what happened to these kids.
And don't forget, they also moved the shooting range 3 years after. Earlier,
yeah, why'd you move it? Why did you have to move it? Yeah.
Exactly, that's a little suspicious too. So maybe we're missing something, but all facts lead to the conclusion that it was probably an accident of sorts on the shooting range. And the kids were just the end of that as well.
I don't want to make a joke out of this, but someone was definitely like, guys, maybe having a shooting range on this mountain that people hike on is not a good idea.
Probably not. They learned the hard way. Yeah. For sure.
Well, that was the story of the Frog Boys of South Korea. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating or let me know what you thought of it in the comments. A rating and a share go a really, really long way in the realm of podcasts. I'd also love to hear your suggestions if you want me to cover any cases that you might have an interest in. You can reach out to me at my Instagram at Cinderella with 6 L's. And thank you so much for tuning in. We'll catch you at the next one.
What's going to be next?
I don't know.